Fort Buford, Dakota Territory, January 1876. Snowbound 11 weeks, rations nearly gone, 41 men facing starvation before spring thaw. Quartermaster Captain Silas Crane, desperate, cracked open 6 barrels buried in the storehouse corner. Hardtack packed in St. Louis in 1846, 30 years forgotten. The lids came off, and instead of rot, the smell of a bakery rolled out. The biscuits were stone-hard, pale tan, perfectly intact. Crane broke one with a hatchet, soaked a fragment, and tasted it. Fresh. The 6 barrels held 1,800 pounds of bread that had ignored 3 decades of freeze and neglect, and it saved every man at Fort Buford. Stay tuned as we uncover the story of the one survival ration that outlasted every other emergency supply on the frontier, the baker who perfected it, and why the simplest food in history still holds a lesson for anyone who thinks preservation requires a freezer. Elias Cormack was not a frontier hero. He was a baker in St. Louis, Missouri, a second-generation Irish immigrant who had learned the trade from his father in the cramped brick ovens of the Riverfront district. By 1845, when the story begins, Cormack was 37 years old and owned a small bakery on 2nd Street that produced ship biscuit for the steamboat lines running the Missouri and Mississippi. Ship biscuit, or hardtack, was an ancient food. Flour and water mixed stiff, rolled flat, docked with holes, and baked until rock hard. Seamen had eaten it for centuries. Soldiers had marched on it since the Revolution. It was not glamorous, it was not delicious. It was fuel, and when made correctly, it could last a year in a dry hold without moldering. The problem was that much of the hardtack supplied to the Army in the 1840s was not made correctly. Contract bakers, racing to fill orders at the lowest price, would cut corners. They'd use wetter dough to speed mixing. They'd bake at too high a heat, which drove moisture out of the surface but left the core damp. They'd pack biscuits into barrels while they were still warm, trapping steam that condensed into mildew within weeks. Government inspectors were supposed to reject substandard biscuit, but inspections were cursory and contracts were political. The result was that soldiers routinely opened barrels to find hardtack crawling with weevils, spotted with blue mold, or crumbling into a sour, inedible powder. The standard Army hardtack of 1845 had a shelf life of roughly 6 months in temperate weather and far less in the wet heat of a coastal garrison. It was a ration men ate because they had to, not because it was good, and often not even because it was safe. Elias Cormack believed hardtack could be better. He didn't just believe it. He had test barrels in the back of his bakery that he'd been aging for 8 years, and the biscuits inside were as sound as the day they were baked. He had a method, and he had been trying for 2 years to get the Army to pay attention. The method was simple to describe and exacting to execute. Cormack used only high-extraction wheat flour and water. No salt, no fat, no yeast. Salt, he had learned, was hygroscopic. It pulled moisture from the air over time and softened the biscuit, creating a favorable environment for mold. Fat went rancid. Yeast introduced fermentation compounds that broke down the starch. The pure flour and water biscuit, if baked until its moisture content dropped below 5%, became biologically inert. There was no water for bacteria to grow in, no medium for mold spores to germinate. It was not food as living organisms understood it. It was edible ceramic. To achieve that moisture level, Cormack baked his hardtack twice. The first bake was at moderate heat for an hour, which cooked the dough through and drove off most of the water. The second bake was at very low heat for 4 to 6 hours, effectively dehydrating the biscuit to bone dryness without scorching it. Between bakes, he let the biscuits rest for a full day in a warm, dry proofing room, so the remaining moisture could equalize before the final drive. He docked each biscuit with a pattern of 49 holes, more than the standard 16, to ensure steam could escape from every part of the dough. The result was a biscuit with a moisture content of 3 to 4%, so hard you could strike a lucifer match on its edge, so stable it could sit in an unmarked barrel for a generation and emerge unchanged. Cormack presented samples to the Army Commissary Department in St. Louis in 1844. The purchasing officer, a major named Thaddeus Bunker, examined a biscuit, tapped it against his desk, and asked how much it cost. Cormac told him it was roughly 20% more than the standard contract biscuit because the double bake took more time and more fuel. Bunker told him the Army did not need biscuit that lasted 30 years. It needed biscuit that was cheap, that could be delivered in bulk, and that soldiers would eat without too many official complaints. Cormac's hardtack was overbuilt, overpriced, and too hard to chew. Men would hate it. They hate the standard biscuit too, Cormac pointed out, but at least mine won't poison them with mold. Bunker was not persuaded. He placed the standing order with the low bidder, a large bakery in Cincinnati that produced biscuit by the ton using steam-heated ovens and a one-bake process that looked efficient on paper and delivered barrels that started molding before they left the warehouse. Cormac lost the contract, but not his conviction. He continued making hardtack for the steamboat trade and for private customers heading west on the Oregon Trail, people who wanted provisions that would survive the crossing. An immigrant named Sarah Whitlock, who bought 2 barrels of Cormac's biscuit in the spring of 1845, wrote back from Oregon City 9 months later to say the last of the hardtack was still perfectly edible after being soaked in river water, dragged over the Rockies, and cached in a hole in the ground for 2 weeks while the company scouted a ford. She said her family called it Cormac's Everlasting Bricks, and that she wished she'd bought 5 barrels instead of 2. Testimonials like that mattered to individual customers, but not to the Army, which operated on volume and price and the institutional assumption that soldiers would always grumble no matter what you fed them. Elias Cormac's bakery ticked along, small and steady, and his method remained a curiosity known to a few dozen river captains and emigrants and almost nobody in the military supply chain. That changed briefly in the spring of 1846. The Mexican-American War was escalating, and General Stephen Kearny was organizing the Army of the West at Fort Leavenworth for the march to Santa Fe. The Quartermaster General put out an emergency call for hardtack, as much as could be produced in 6 weeks, and the low bidders were already swamped. A junior supply officer named Lieutenant Horatio Baird, who had heard about Cormac from a steamboat captain, rode to St. Louis and offered him a contract for 8,000 pounds of biscuit to be delivered in 20 days. Cormac accepted. He hired 2 extra bakers, ran his ovens around the clock, and produced the 8,000 pounds on schedule. Every biscuit was double-baked. Every barrel was lined with oiled canvas and packed in tight layers separated by muslin to keep the biscuits from grinding each other into dust on the march. Lieutenant Baird paid the invoice without argument because he had no choice, and the biscuit went west with Kearny's column. The soldiers hated it immediately. Kearny's men were marching across the dry plains of Kansas and New Mexico, thirsty and tired, and the last thing they wanted to eat at the end of a 30-mile day was a biscuit they had to soak in their canteen water for 15 minutes before it was soft enough to bite. They called it Kearny's Jawbreaker, Santa Fe Stone, and various less printable names. They complained that it wore down their teeth. They traded it to Mexican villagers for tortillas when they could. The Army took note of the complaints, as armies do, and when the war ended in 1848, the commissary department returned to buying the cheaper, softer, faster spoiling biscuit that soldiers still complained about, but complained about slightly less. Cormac's contract was not renewed. The barrels that had already been delivered faded into the corners of the supply system. Some were eaten, some were discarded. Some sat in depots and frontier forts, unmarked and unnoticed, for years, for decades. The baker himself died in 1863 at 55 of a lung ailment common to men who spent their lives breathing flour dust. His bakery was sold to a brewer. His method was written down nowhere but in his own ledger, which was thrown away during the sale. By the end of the Civil War, nobody in the Army remembered the name Elias Cormac or knew that a brick-hard biscuit packed in St. Louis in 1846 was still sitting quietly in a half-dozen frontier storehouses, waiting for the moment someone would crack open the barrel and discover that flour and water, properly handled, can ignore time almost completely. That moment arrived on the 10th of January, 1876, at Fort Buford, in the person of Captain Silas Crane. Crane was 31 years old, a West Point graduate from Maine who had been assigned to the Dakota Outpost 3 years earlier and had learned more about winter survival in those 3 years than the Academy had taught him in 4. Fort Buford sat at the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers, a sprawling log and adobe post that served as a supply hub for the northern plains. It was not a comfortable assignment. Winter temperatures routinely fell to 30 below. Wind scoured the parade ground at 40 miles an hour, and the nearest real town was Bismarck, 200 miles east. The winter of 1875 to 76 had been brutal even by Dakota standards. The first heavy snow fell on the 28th of October. By November 10th, the river was frozen solid and the wagon road to Bismarck was impassable. The fort was supposed to have laid in a full winter supply of rations by the end of September, but a series of procurement delays and the quartermaster's error had left the stores shorter than anyone realized until it was too late. When Crane conducted his winter inventory in early January, the math was stark. 41 men stationed at the fort, 4 months until reliable resupply, rations on hand for maybe 6 weeks at subsistence level. He went through the storehouse systematically, looking for anything that might have been overlooked. He found a crate of dried apples that had fused into a solid block of brown sugar and mold, a barrel of salt pork that had turned so rancid the smell made his eyes water, a sack of desiccated vegetables, a Civil War-era experiment in dehydrated soup mix that had absorbed enough moisture to solidify into a brick of green-black rot. The frontier was littered with failed preservation experiments, and most of them were sitting in Crane's storehouse. Then he found the 6 barrels in the back corner, under a tarp that had probably been thrown over them a decade ago and forgotten. The stenciling on the wood was faded but legible. Hard bread, 1846, Cornac Bakery, St. Louis. A manifest tacked to the wall nearby listed the barrels as part of a surplus lot transferred from Fort Union in 1867, which had received them from Fort Leavenworth in 1858, which had held them in deep storage since the Mexican War. The barrels had crossed the plains 3 times and sat undisturbed for 30 years. Crane fully expected to open them and find a petrified mass of organic decay. What he found instead was 1,800 pounds of perfectly preserved hardtack. The science behind that preservation was simple, as all genuinely durable food science tends to be. Flour is composed primarily of starch and protein. When mixed with water and heated, the starch gelatinizes and the protein networks set, creating a solid matrix. If enough water is driven out of that matrix, below the threshold where microbes can metabolize, which is around 5% moisture content for most bacteria and molds, the food becomes shelf-stable indefinitely. It may experience a slow degradation of vitamins and a gradual browning of the starch over decades, but it will not rot, mold, or become unsafe to eat. The key is achieving and maintaining that low moisture content in a sealed or semi-sealed container. Cormac's double baking did the first part. The oiled canvas barrel liners and the dry climate of the northern plains did the second. A standard Army hardtack of the 1870s, produced under the typical one-bake contract, had a moisture content of 8 to 12%. It was softer and easier to chew, but developed blue mold within a year if not consumed. Cormac's product, at 3 to 4%, was physically incapable of supporting microbial life. It was not cracker. It was a dehydrated ration that happened to look like cracker. The 200 pounds of extra flour per barrel that the Army had refused to pay for in 1846 had bought them 30 years of shelf stability they didn't know they were going to need. Crane didn't know the moisture content numbers. He didn't need to. He had 41 hungry men and 6 barrels of unknown food that smelled fresh. He tested it carefully, soaked fragments in water for several hours, examined them for off-colors or odors, fed small portions to a volunteer corporal for 2 days, and watched for signs of illness. The corporal reported no digestive distress and an unexpected feeling of fullness. Crane approved the biscuit for general issue. For the next 6 weeks, the men of Fort Buford ate 1846 hardtack as their primary starch ration. They soaked it in melted snow, in thin soup made from whatever meat they could hunt, in coffee when coffee was available. They ground it into powder with stones and stirred it into bacon grease. They ate it straight, gnawing on corners like dogs on bones, because hunger makes a man patient with his teeth. The hardtack provided roughly 100 calories per biscuit, composed almost entirely of complex carbohydrates with a small amount of protein from the wheat gluten. It was not a complete diet, but combined with the fort's remaining salted meat and a dwindling supply of dried beans, it was enough to keep every man alive until the first supply wagons broke through the snow in early March. No one got scurvy, no one got dysentery. The weevils that infested the standard biscuit had never touched Cormac's barrels because the biscuits had been baked so dry that insect eggs, which require some ambient moisture to survive, had not made it through the process. The men of Fort Buford were eating the most sanitary ration on the frontier, produced when most of them were not yet born. Word of the discovery spread through the Army's Department of Dakota. A report written by the post surgeon, a man named Dr. Henry Lippincott, documented the nutritional adequacy and microbiological safety of the aged hardtack with a degree of thoroughness unusual for a frontier medical officer. Lippincott sent samples to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, where they were examined and pronounced chemically stable and organoleptically sound. The report generated a brief flurry of interest in hardtack preservation. A circular from the Commissary General recommending double-baked biscuit for long-term storage at remote posts, and a contract request for bidders who could meet a 5% moisture specification. The circular was filed. The contract request attracted exactly 0 bidders because the commercial baking industry of 1876 had no interest in spending extra fuel to produce a product that tasted worse and cost more. Within 3 years, the Army had reverted to standard hardtack, and the brief institutional memory of Elias Cormac's method faded once again. The frontier moved on. Railroads replaced supply wagons. Canned goods replaced hardtack as the emergency ration of choice. Freeze-dried and vacuum-sealed technologies eventually arrived. The idea that the simplest possible food, flour and water, could outperform all of them in pure longevity became a footnote in a few quartermaster logs, and then not even that. But the principle did not go away. It sat in the back of the supply chain like the barrels in the corner, waiting to be rediscovered by people who need food that will not fail. During the Second World War, the U.S. military experimented with survival biscuits made from wheat and oat flour baked to extremely low moisture levels, inspired in part by reports of Civil War hardtack that had turned up still edible during construction projects on old battlefields. Those biscuits were packed in waterproof tins and issued in lifeboat rations for the Navy, where they were rated for 10 years of storage, but frequently tested safe after 30. The lineage stretched back through the quartermaster reports to Fort Buford, and through those reports to the ovens of a St. Louis baker who knew what he was doing and nobody listened. The most remarkable test of the principle came inadvertently in 1951, when a construction crew digging the foundation for a new building at the Jefferson Barracks military post in Missouri uncovered a sealed cask of hardtack stamped with an 1846 date and the name of a St. Louis bakery that records confirmed had been owned by an E. Cormac. The cask had been buried under 6 feet of earth when an old storehouse was demolished in the 1880s and never exhumed. The biscuit inside was tested by the Quartermaster Corps Food Laboratory. It showed a moisture content of 3.8%, 0 mold colonies, 0 detectable bacterial contamination, and 0 nutritional degradation beyond a minor loss of thiamine that would have been irrelevant in any real survival scenario. A chemist ate a piece on camera for an Army newsreel and pronounced it a little stale but entirely wholesome. The biscuit was 105 years old. Elias Cormac's name did not make the newsreel. It rarely does. The people who build things that last are rarely the people who get remembered, because what they built works so quietly and for so long that it becomes part of the background. A wall that holds heat. A biscuit that holds calories. The materials are ordinary. The execution is exact. The payoff arrives decades later in a starving fort or a frozen morning when someone who needs the thing finds it exactly where it was left, doing exactly what it was made to do. The forgotten survival food that never spoils does not come in a brightly colored package. It does not require a refrigerator or a chemical preservative. It is the product of 2 ingredients and a process so careful that time cannot find a purchase on it. That food saved the garrison at Fort Buford. It saved sailors in lifeboats and soldiers in siege lines and families on the Oregon Trail who had nothing left to eat but the bricks of flour they'd thought to bring when everything else had failed. It is still the cheapest, longest-lasting emergency ration ever devised by human hands, and the fact that most people have never heard of it is no accident. The simplest tools are the ones we take for granted until the moment we need them. And if you've ever thrown away food that spoiled before you could use it, or worried about what your pantry will look like after a power outage that lasts 2 weeks, you already know why a bone-dry biscuit baked twice and sealed from moisture is worth more than a freezer full of perishables. The earth holds heat. The flour holds energy. Both of them remember, and both of them give back what they stored long after everything else has failed. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's the longest lasting food you've ever kept in your pantry? Hit that subscribe button for one forgotten survival technique every week, and hit the like button if this story changed how you think about what belongs in your emergency supplies. Because the wisest preparations are often the simplest ones, and the people who made them deserve to be remembered.